Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. And, we always like to get right into it here, get you caught up with everything that's happening in the podcasting world quickly and, in a way that makes sense for people like you who really want to stay on top of their game, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's always so much going on in podcasting, right? And so we like to cut through all the noise and really pull out the stuff that matters the most and, really figure out why it matters and what it means for all of us who are trying to make great podcasts.
Yeah, totally. So we're going to be going through, basically we're going through the latest Podwires newsletter. They always have the inside scoop on everything that's happening. And we'll be talking about, big partnerships, the kind that can really change things for podcasters, how people are making money from their shows, like what's new there. Yeah, and that whole problem of how do you actually find good podcasts these days, right?
Yeah.
There's so much out there. And of course, where the money is going, which companies are spending big on podcast ads and why, and and some of the events that are happening that are really bringing the podcasting community together.
It's a really interesting mix of stuff this time around. There's some really big changes happening that we'll get into, like we said, and some things that are just kind of ongoing challenges, but are really important to keep in mind.
For sure. Well, okay, let's just jump right in. Then there's this story that caught my eye right away. It was about Dan Harris. The 10% happier guy. He just signed this big exclusive deal with Libsyn. They're going to be hosting his show and handling all his advertising.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, right? I mean, Dan Harris, he's kind of a big deal in the podcasting world. And, for him to go with Libsyn, it makes you think, right?
Yeah. What's the thinking there?
Well, Libsyn, they've been around forever.
Yeah.
Right? Like 20 years. Okay. They really know what they're doing. And they've got this whole advertising system set up that's, pretty sophisticated. And
you're thinking for someone like Dan Harris, it's about, he gets to keep doing his thing, be independent, but he doesn't have to worry about all the technical stuff and the business side of getting sponsors and all of that.
Exactly. It's like he gets the best of both worlds, right? Creative control and, people who can handle all the complicated advertising side of things.
It does make you wonder, though, right? Because there are all these other platforms now, right, that do everything, right? Like they host your show, they help you get sponsors, they do it all. So why would someone go with a more, traditional hosting company like Libsyn?
That's a good question. And I think it tells you something about how the industry is changing, right?
Yeah.
There's definitely a place for those all-in-one platforms, especially for people who are just starting out. But for someone like Dan Harris, who already has a big audience and, who's really established, it might make more sense to go with a company that just focuses on hosting and advertising and can really do that well.
Yeah, like a specialist, right?
Exactly.
Okay, well, speaking of platforms, Spotify, they're not slowing down at all, are they? They're expanding their partner program again, making it available in a bunch of new places.
Yeah, that's right. 9 new markets, actually, in Europe and Oceania. So that's a pretty big deal for podcasters in those areas.
Yeah.
Right, because it means they have another way to make money from their shows. Through Spotify.
And it's not just about, being on Spotify. It's about all those extra things they offer, right? Being able to put video on your podcast for people who have Spotify Premium and the ads that they run on the platform,
Yeah, it gives creators more ways to make money. And that's always a good thing, right? Especially as the industry gets more and more competitive.
Definitely. And they're saying that the program has been really successful so far, right? Like some creators are making way more money than they were before.
Yeah, they're talking about like a 300% increase in revenue for some people. And apparently some of the top creators are making 6 figures a month, which is, pretty impressive.
That is pretty wild. I mean, it makes you wonder if those numbers will hold up as the program expands, and they get more creators involved.
Mm-hmm.
But still, it's definitely something to keep an eye on, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's going to be interesting to see how this changes things for creators in those new markets and, how Spotify's whole approach to podcasting evolves over time.
Okay, so let's talk about something that, honestly is a bit of a headache for a lot of podcasters and for listeners too, really. It's that whole issue of discovery, right? Like there are more podcasts than ever, which is great for listeners, but it also makes it really hard to find the good stuff,
It's a classic problem, right? Like the more choices you have, the harder it is to actually choose. And with podcasts, it's really tough because, you can't just like flip through a magazine or something. You have to kind of know what you're looking for.
Yeah, and the algorithms are okay, right? Like they can help, but they're not perfect. And sometimes they just recommend stuff you've already heard or things that are popular but not actually good,
For sure. So
Right.
what are we supposed to do?
Well, Podwires, they're trying something interesting. They're asking podcast producers, the people who make the shows, what they listen to and what they think is good and why.
That's a cool idea because those people, They have a different perspective, right?
Yeah.
They know what goes into making a good podcast, and they can spot things that maybe the average listener wouldn't even notice.
Totally. It's like getting recommendations from the experts, right?
Exactly. And it's a way to kind of cut through all the data and the algorithms and just get down to like, what are the podcasts that people who know podcasts really love?
Yeah, I think that's so smart. And, for listeners, it's a way to find new shows that they might not have come across otherwise. And for podcasters, it's a chance to see what their peers are listening to, what they think is good.
Yeah, it's a win-win, really. And
Yeah.
hopefully it'll help to surface some of those hidden gems that are out there.
Okay, well, let's get into the money stuff because, that always tells an interesting story about what's happening in the industry. Magellan AI just released their report on podcast ad spending for February. And there were some pretty big surprises in there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But first, let's talk about the big dog, right? BetterHelp. They're still at the top, spending almost $5 million on podcast ads in February alone.
Yeah, they are really committed to podcast advertising, huh?
Seems like it was working for them, obviously.
But okay, let's talk about the real shocker. BMW, out of nowhere, they increased their ad spending by almost 18,500% month over month. They went from spending almost nothing to almost $1.3 million.
That's insane, right? Where did that come from?
Yeah, it seems like they just decided to jump in with both feet.
And they weren't the only ones. Samsung increased their spending by almost 10,000%, and Trellix even more than that, over 22,000%. Even Virgin had a huge increase, although they were starting from a much smaller base.
So what does all this mean? Why are all these big companies suddenly pouring money into podcast advertising?
Well, I think it's a sign that the industry is maturing, right? Podcast advertising isn't just for, startups anymore. Big companies are realizing that it's a really effective way to reach people.
Especially, those specific demographics like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and I think it also shows that podcasting is becoming more mainstream, right? It's not just a niche thing anymore. It's something that everyone's doing, and that means there's a lot of money to be made.
And for podcasters, this is good news, right? It means there are more potential sponsors out there and maybe more opportunities to make a living from their shows.
Exactly. And, the fact that a lot of these big spenders are targeting sports and comedy podcasts, that tells us something about where the audience is, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. So podcasters who are making shows in those genres, they might have a better chance of attracting those big sponsors.
For sure. And it also means that podcasters need to be thinking about their audience really carefully. Who are they trying to reach and what kind of content will appeal to them and to potential sponsors?
Yeah, if you're making a show about knitting, you're probably not going to get a sponsorship from BMW.
Probably not, although you never know.
True. Okay, well, let's move on to some of the events that are happening in the podcasting world because there's always a lot going on and it's a good way to, connect with other people in the industry.
For sure. So there's the Black Effect Podcast Festival that's coming up in April in Atlanta. It's a really big deal with live shows and panels and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun.
And it's a great way to, meet other podcasters, learn from each other, and just kind of be a part of the community.
And then there's this new thing on the West Coast called Off the Record. It's a podcast industry think tank in Los Angeles.
Oh, yeah, I read about that. It's run by Good Tape Magazine. And it's all about bringing together people from different parts of the industry, like executives and creators and brands, to talk about the big issues and try to find solutions.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, like a way to kind of move the industry forward.
Exactly. And I think it's really important to have these kinds of conversations because the podcasting world is changing so fast and there are always new challenges and opportunities,
Yeah, totally. And then, of course, there are the big media companies that are still investing heavily in podcasting. Like the New York Times, they just announced a bunch of promotions in their audio division, which shows that they're serious about this stuff.
Yeah, they've got some really successful shows like The Daily and Hard Fork,
Yeah.
and they're clearly not slowing down.
Okay, so there's one more thing we need to talk about, and this one's kind of a big deal. It's Spreaker's integration with Sounder AI.
Oh, yeah, this is really interesting. It's all about contextual targeting for podcast ads, which is, kind of a revolutionary idea.
So explain this to me like I'm 5 years old. What is contextual targeting, and why is it such a big deal?
Okay, so in the past, advertisers have basically had to target podcasts based on their genre, right? If you're selling running shoes, you might advertise on a running podcast, but with contextual targeting, you can get way more specific because Sounder's AI actually listens to the content of the podcast and figures out what's being talked about.
So it can tell if they're talking about running shoes specifically.
Exactly. And
Nice.
then it can match those ads with those specific conversations, which means that advertisers are reaching a much more targeted audience and podcasters are getting more relevant ads.
So it's a win-win for everyone, right?
Exactly. And Spreaker, they've rolled this out for both direct sales and programmatic advertising, which means it's going to be available to a lot of podcasters.
And this isn't just some random experiment, right? Other companies are doing this too, like Novi Entertainment and Dax US.
Yeah, it seems like this is the future of podcast advertising. And it's really exciting because it means that podcasters with niche content might finally be able to make some money from their shows.
Yeah, because before it was all about those broad categories, right? But now with this AI, they can really drill down into the specifics.
Exactly. And it also means that podcasters need to be really careful about their metadata.
Yeah.
The descriptions of their shows and episodes, because that's how the AI figures out what's being talked about.
So if you want to attract those targeted ads, you need to make sure your metadata is accurate and up to date.
Exactly. And that's good advice for any podcaster, really, whether you're using contextual targeting or not.
Okay, well, that was a lot of information, but hopefully it was helpful and, it gives you a good sense of what's happening in the podcasting world right now.
Definitely, there are a lot of changes happening, and it's an exciting time to be involved in podcasting.
Absolutely. So if you want to stay on top of all of this, you should definitely subscribe to the Podwires newsletter. They're the ones who brought us all this great information. You can sign up at joinpodwires.com. That's joinpodwires.com.
And just a quick note, all the information we talked about today has been carefully checked by the editors at Podwires to make sure it's accurate. But of course, things can change, so, always double check.
Always good advice. Well, that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah.
And one last thought before we go. We talked about all these new technologies and how they're changing advertising, but what about the content itself? Do you think these changes will affect the kinds of podcasts that people make and the way we listen to them? Just something to think about.
That's a good one.
All right, now we're really done. See you next time.